Hi, my name is Sumaya Siddiqa, and I'm going to talk to you about the infamous asbestos tragedy in a small town called Libby, which is located in the state of Montana. Here's a table of contents. This presentation will start by going over the purpose and objectives. We'll then go on to talk about the history of Libby, Montana, and then the exposure of characteristics and vermiculite workers from the years 1935 to 1981. Then, we will talk about the St. George Respiratory Questionnaire, followed by the exposure pathway evaluations, and then move on to asbestos removal, as well as the U.S. versus W.R. Grace and Company case study. The main purpose of the next several slides is to elaborate on the asbestos industry in Libby, Montana. What sets Libby apart from other small towns is the toxic dust from the vermiculite mines that have helped the town prosper for many decades. However, over time it killed hundreds of residents and sickened thousands. To this day, victims continue to surface. We will examine the exposures and health effects that workers and residents were subject to while living in this town. Libby, Montana is a small town in the mountains that is the home of one of America's worst man-made environmental disasters. It can be traced back to 1919 when companies started to pull vermiculite out of the mines of Libby. Vermiculite was commercially known as zonolite and was used in multiple construction materials, for example, insulation in buildings and homes. Decades upon decades of mining vermiculite exposed workers and residents to toxic asbestos dust. Vermiculite mining in Libby began more than 80 years ago when Ian Alley brought the Rainy Creek claims and launched Zonolite Company. Before Grace took over ownership of the mine, a number of employees developed lung problems and several fatalities were reported. Despite these health issues, the company claimed they were unaware of the health hazards of mining and milling vermiculite when they purchased the business. But W.R. Grace executives did in fact know about the mine's high level of asbestos dust and that exposure to the dust was damaging to the lungs. Yet they never said anything to the employees. Townspeople were also affected by the asbestos-tainted vermiculite, as Grace had distributed their leftover vermiculite for use in playgrounds, backyards, gardens, roads, and a number of other popular locations in the town. Here we have a table containing the relationship between lung cancer, mesothelioma, and asbestos relative to the number of workers within a certain cohort, how many years they were worked, also known as the time they were directly exposed to asbestos. As we can see, among the 1672 deaths, those reported for lung cancer had the shortest mean employment duration. Lung cancer caused by asbestos is different than pleural mesothelioma, as asbestos-related cancer that develops in the lining of the lungs instead of inside. Both diseases take decades to develop, but only months to spread. In Libby, Montana, mortality rate for asbestosis and lung cancer increased with cumulative exposure to airborne fibers. In a cross-sectional descriptive study, measures were used to describe the respiratory health status of individuals. This table compares the Libby St. George Respiratory Questionnaire mean scores with scores obtained from a representative population sample. When observing the results given, it can be noted that the Libby cohort, the general population of women, was higher than men on the activity scale but lower than men on impacts. As expected, the general population symptoms, activity, and impact scores increased with age, while the Libby cohort symptoms and impact scores actually decreased, possibly related to the accommodation of the chronic condition. This chart is a qualitative understanding of which potential pathways impacted residents of Libby. As one can see from the chart, occupational hazards outweigh the other pathways. A possible scenario for this exposure can be when a former worker was handling and processing contaminated vermiculite, or when current workers were exposed while processing buildings. A high evaluation feasibility indicates data was available for most of the sites and the pathway can be reliably evaluated. Several surveys in the plywood plant found asbestos. It was removed and later found again. The following summarizes lumber mill documentation of asbestos-containing materials in the plywood plant that were found and remediated and then found again. The roots of the United States versus W.R. Grace case stretch back to nearly a century to the beginning of the mining operations in the vicinity of Libby. It was not until the late 1990s, however, that the extent of the problem came to light fully, leading to the EPA's cleanup action. Townspeople were also affected by the asbestos-tainted vermiculite as Grace had distributed their leftover vermiculite for use in playgrounds, backyards, gardens, roads, and a number of other popular locations. The EPA declared a public health emergency in Libby, a first of the agency. This chart shows the relationship between types of exposure and the percentage of those who suffered from a pleural abnormality. The majority of people from this cohort that were impacted were Grace workers and the secondary contractors. By 2018, the EPA's cleanup efforts finally began to wind down. The EPA was formulating plans for the future for the Zonalite Mountain Mine and access roads. The final step of Libby's residential removal program is restoration. Attics are re-insulated, accent holes and incidental damages are repaired, and items were returned to their original location. Outside, lawns are resodded, and a town once plagued with a silent but deadly disease is now on the road to recovery.